Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I want to talk to you about, do professors actually read Rate My Professor? And is it actually useful for professors? So if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out to get through graduate school that I wanted to pay the favor forward and help you out. So when I was in undergrad, I used to think, do professors actually read the reviews in Rate My Professor, right? And this actually happens in many different fields. It's not unique now. You can rate your medical doctor, you can rate your restaurants, you can rate your veterinarian's office, all sorts of different things. But when I was an undergrad, this was a really big thing. And I think people still use Rate My Professor. And the answer to that question, now that I'm actually a professor, and I was on that side where I was actually writing things, as a young undergrad. This was, 15 years ago. Now on the professor side, I could say absolutely. We do read those things. Now, is Rate My Professor anonymous? Yes, I have no idea who wrote the reviews. So don't feel bad if you write reviews on it. So then the question is it actually helpful for professors, right? So in a lot of ways, it's not really all that helpful in a lot of different ways, because the feedback is quite variable. And what you're getting in terms of the feedback on Rate My Professor is either it's called being at tails of the distribution, right? So there's reviews that are going to be very, very negative. So I guess it's this way, very negative, and they're not going to be necessarily sort of predictive of the entire sample. There's going to be reviews that are going to be very positive from people that either got good grades or they really enjoyed the class, but they're not going to be predictive of the entire sample. And so the way that you should be thinking about this is that the reviews on Rate My Professor generally are highly skewed. And why is that the reason why they're highly skewed? Well, to incentivize people, to incentivize somebody, a student, to actually use my Rate My Professor and actually expend that energy. It takes time, takes effort to actually go there and fill it out. They have to be emotionally charged in some sort of way, either a positive way or a negative way. It's just like any sort of review that's out there. And those reviews tend to be more predictive of, at the tails of the distribution and the tails of, the sort of a really positive or negative experience. And it doesn't really tell you a lot about what's really going on. And if you're making judgments and decisions based on the tails of the distribution, whether they're really negative or really positive, you can often make inferences that are just kind of off the mark, and they're not going to be sort of predictive of the entire sample. So you have to be very careful with what that actually means, right? And another thing that you should be thinking about in terms of Rate My Professor is that there is different goals in terms of education that we often think about, right? So there's one goal, the immediate sort of experience that you have, and that you had a really good class and people understood what you were, that the professor was trying to communicate something to you, and then you understood it, and it really sunk in, and it became really just a fun experience. And maybe there's exercises and stuff like that where were like enlightened in a lot of different ways. You had this immediate sort of emotional reaction, and you really wanted to rate a sort of positive review on Rate My Professor, where you're going to go and do that immediately. But in 5 days, in 10 days, in a year, in 5 years, you often forget about those responses that you feel, right? You don't carry them with you. Your memory sort of degrades over time. You can't possibly think about those things that you were thinking about from years and years ago, unless the lesson stuck with you somehow. Now, how can that actually stick with you? Well, there's a couple of ways, right? One way is to have a very positive, enlightenment sort of experience where this was a wonderful experience, and you remember that sort of glowing feeling that you have. Another way is you acquire some information. That's hopefully what I am going to, and that's what my target is that you acquire information such that you can retrieve that information and you have a completely different repertoire in the responses that you have when you encounter something in the future. You don't necessarily know that it was from the class or my class or somebody else's class, but you know that you have this knowledge and you're going to make a decision differently going in the future. That's what I'm hopefully that's where I'm going to target at. So and then there's also the sort of very negative responses or negative sort of experiences. And those actually tend to stick with you a long time. And so some of the lessons, even though it's a really negative experience, that was really just awful and you didn't really like it, or you felt that the professor was picking on you in some sort of way, that some of those lessons actually stick with you for a very long time. A good example of this to think about is doing Navy SEALs training, right? Like it's really not fun. It stinks. It's awful. But, if you talk to somebody that's actually gone through that training, or, you just listen to the stories that resonates with them, that experience was a big thing for them. And they will continue on and actually embrace that experience and run with it. So it's not necessarily you want always positive experiences. You don't want always negative experiences. But for me, my goal is to have sort of you're getting information such that you can make better decisions in the future. And maybe you don't know where that comes from, but it's coming from someplace and it's motivating you to make a better decision. You have much better repertoire and you actually can do something. So the feedback that you experience on, Rate My Professor, that immediate feedback, is not necessarily going to be judging what's happening in the future, right? You're not necessarily getting a good idea of what's happening in the future because in 5 years or in 10 years, that person they might be making much better decisions, but they're not necessarily thinking that, oh, it came from that class, right? Like it's not going to be an immediate thing, right? So it's not going to be like, oh, we're going to be tied from that outcome that maybe, I teach business, right? So maybe that they make a lot of money in one particular sort of company, or maybe that they make the company a little bit more innovative. Well, they're not going to link that to my class in any sort of way, but the stuff that they learned might have sort of trickled down and they're actually going to make a better decision that's actually going to impact the outcome. So it's not necessarily all that clear in terms of, the outcomes that you actually get. And so it's not only on the firm, for example, but it could also be thinking about like what is their life outcomes, right? So if I can give them a little bit more information, if I can help somebody get a little bit more information such that they become better performers in 10 years and they have better health outcomes, they live longer, they have more joyous life, for example, they make a little bit more money. Well, that's a really good thing. And that's my end goal. It's not whether I actually get ratings on Rate My Professor that's actually going to matter, right? So that is the bigger things is I'm looking at, okay, how can I impact that stuff rather than what's going to happen in Rate My Professor, right? So sometimes you get really bad reviews. Sometimes you get really good reviews that are in Rate My Professor, but you have to think that's not your outcome as a professor. And that's probably not what, even though that's going to be the most immediate feedback that I am going to get and I'm going to be paying attention to other than teaching ratings, which they themselves have a lot of different biases and stuff like that in them. But, that's what I'm thinking about is how can I actually impact somebody's life so they can become successful in the sense that they just live a very fulfilling life. And the other thing that's really important that you should be also thinking about in a distribution of students. So what I'm not necessarily targeting is at everybody that's in the classroom, because I know that everybody is learning at their different way. I want to make sure that everybody learns and they do a very good job. But I also want to make sure that the people that are really paying attention, that they're really absorbing, and that they are passionate about something, that they are getting something that they can take that. And so let's say that their career outcome would have been a manager at a bank, right? Like at maybe a local bank in Florida. That's where I live. So they become a local manager at a bank. That's what their career outcome would have been if they would not have taken my course. But I want to think about the counterfactual. When they take my course, then I'm going to motivate them to think about, okay, instead of being a bank manager at a local bank in Florida, well, they're going to be the CEO of, Wells Fargo, and that they're going to make a very large impact by taking my course, that they're actually going to make changes in their life such that they're going to strive a little bit more. Now, that is impossible to measure. That's extremely difficult to measure. We could do all sorts of wonderful things, and there's lots of sort of statistical techniques to try to capture that stuff. But that is impossible to capture because we all live just one life. We don't have all these sort of secondary lives, and we run into many sort of different breaches of life that we can choose one or the other, and we have to choose one. And then so we can't necessarily get that information, right? And if they didn't take my course, what would have happened? We can try to get there, but that's very difficult to actually get. And that's what I'm looking for, is not necessarily, the good positive reviews or even negative reviews, and that I can actually take information from that, but rather the fact that, am I actually making an impact in somebody's life such that they're going to make a much more fulfilling life in 10 to 20 years from now. Now, the other thing that you should be thinking about is it actually useful for students to actually get this information on Rate My Professor? So I'm gonna sort of take a different approach. So some of you would think that, yeah, okay, it's really good to get this information, and then they can actually get this information and make a decision on that. I'm actually going to take a little bit of a different approach and say that, okay, now what is the implication? Now what? What are we actually doing, or what are we seeing once people actually make that decision? So they get that information, right? So that there is, maybe it's 1,000 people read the reviews on, so there's 1,000 students that come up, and they read the reviews and Rate My Professor. Well, and a lot of the reviews are negative, or a lot of them are positive, right? So if you get a lot of negative reviews, the students, the 1,000 students, are going to read this, and of those students, maybe 950 of them are going to be turned off, and they're never going to take your course. Well, there's a quirky 550 people that's left that are actually going to take your course. And now they're either going to not care, or they're just not going to be aware of that information that's out there, or they are actually taking that course because they're interested in the information, or they're just a sucker for punishment, and they can actually see that maybe I'm going to learn something, and it's going to be a completely different experience from them. So what's going to happen is their expectations are totally different when they come into the classroom than they would have been if they didn't read that. And so they might have a very positive experience. So saying their expectations are very low because the teaching ratings or the Rate My Professor reviews were really low. They come in and they realize that, yeah, this was actually a really positive experience. It did make a difference on my life. It changed a lot of different things. So you might have a really cool class because of that. The other thing is that they might come into the classroom feeling like, yeah, I'm not going to do that well in this class, but I'm going to take it anyways. And so they're going to be a completely different group. There's going to be a lot of what's called self-selection that happens into that classroom. And that could actually be a very positive thing in terms of self-selection into that classroom. So if you get a lot of positive reviews on Rate My Professor, and you get tons of them, it's all positive reviews, you might be actually attracting students that are not necessarily the ones that you want to bring into your classroom because they're expecting some other sort of experience. They think maybe it's going to be easy or something like that. But in the long run, those students are actually not going to perform to the level that somebody else is actually going to look at the negative reviews and get that information and sort of run with it and still tackle that material in the class, because either they're really interested in the material, or they thought that, I want to take a tough course and I need to actually build up some of my endurance or build up my character, I guess, within the classroom. So if you get negative reviews in any sort of way on Rate My Professor, don't worry about that. And there's a lot of self-selection that happens on that, and it's providing a lot of information. Now, again, coming back to, is it useful for students? Absolutely, it's useful for students, but in a completely different way. And it's all because of the self-selection that happens. So your classroom experience is going to be either a really positive kind of fun one, Or maybe you're just stuck in a classroom with a bunch of people that are up for a challenge and they really want to take that challenge. And you're going to be pushed in ways that you wouldn't have been pushed before. So that's an important thing to think about. So, but I want to leave you with one last thing in terms of ratemyprofessor.com or any of these reviewing websites, right? So rate my MD, rate my Google reviews, all that kind of stuff. I want you to ask before you actually complete one of these reviews in the future is what do you want to actually get accomplished with that review? So if you're just getting something off your chest and you just have to get it out there and put it out there because you had just a really bad experience, well, that's awesome. Do that kind of stuff. If you want to do that, if that's the thing that you're going to do, that's the world we live in. That's okay. But I also want you to, if you're doing that, I also want you to think about, okay, how can I frame this review? How can I change this review such that it's not just negative? It's not just kind of like, it's not just kind of just letting all that emotion should bubble out, but how can I make that review such a way that the professor or physician or whoever that's actually reading this can actually use that information and run with it and actually make a positive change in maybe it's how they teach, how they cook food. If you're looking at reviews, food reviews, whatever it is, you want to make sure that you take a calculated decision in how you're actually thinking about crafting that review, because that's going to matter in terms of if somebody reads that and they read. So from my side, right? So if I'm a professor and I read a response that's just like, oh, he talks a lot about cats or something like that, which there is one on there. And I do talk a lot about cats. I have somebody that's in veterinary medicine in my family that's close and dear to me. So, and I also got bored one day. But anyways, my point is, so if you have like kind of a review like that, that is just kind of letting steam off, I don't really pay attention to it nearly as much as if it's a really sharp critique of like, there is some sort of positive change that this person can make. And if they make that positive change, I could see that there would be some really wonderful things that are going to happen from that. But you have to be clever. You have to be smart. A lot of this information is being seen before, so it's not necessarily all that new. But just really think about what you want to accomplish when you write this information down publicly online in terms of these reviews. It will help a lot in terms of not only the professor, but also with the students themselves in terms of what they are going to expect from that and what they can actually do going forward with that. All right, so hopefully you like this video. I talked about whether professors actually read ratemyprofessor.com and told you that we absolutely do. At least the people that are suckers for punishment or actually want to learn and develop. And then I gave you some information to consider in terms of how you might actually think about this, or if you are a professor or somebody that's teaching, how you might actually think about reading these reviews and what they actually mean going forward. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. I do appreciate it. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.